10 days. That's all it took. 10 days of strikes, 10 days of fire, 10 days of missiles crossing the sky over the Gulf. What was supposed to be fast, controlled, decisive, is already starting to slip. Because something changed. Not on the battlefield, not in the air, not even in the numbers coming out of the Pentagon. It changed with a single decision. Donald Trump picked up the phone and called Vladimir Putin. Not the other way around. Washington made the call. And that detail tells you everything. This was not a routine check-in between two world leaders. Not after months of silence. Not in the middle of a war that was supposed to be over by now. Not with oil markets shaking, allies scrambling, and the first real signs that the timeline is breaking apart. This is what it looks like when a plan meets reality. Because the story unfolding right now is not about who dropped more bombs or who lost more targets in the opening hours. It is not about the initial shock of the strikes or the headlines that followed. It is about something much harder to control. Time. Who can stretch it? Who can survive it? And who is running out of it first? And right now, 10 days in, with the world watching and the pressure building from every direction, the United States is no longer setting the pace. To understand where this is going, you have to understand how it was supposed to begin. Because the plan, on paper, was simple, clean, decisive. On February 28th, less than 2 weeks ago, the United States and its allies launched a coordinated operation designed to end the conflict before it ever had time to expand. Hundreds of strikes executed within hours. Strategic targets mapped in advance. Command centers, military infrastructure, leadership compounds, all hit in rapid succession. This was not a probing action, it was a statement. The theory behind it was familiar. Remove the head and the body collapses. Disrupt the chain of command and the system breaks down. Create enough shock in the opening hours and the opposition never recovers its footing. And, for a brief moment, it looked like that theory might hold. Early reports suggested critical damage. Key figures were taken out. Communication networks appeared fragmented. The scale and precision of the operation sent a clear signal, not just to Iran but to the rest of the region, that this would be fast, contained, over before it had time to become something larger. The messaging coming out of Washington reflected that confidence. Officials described the strikes as limited in scope but decisive in impact. The expectation was not a prolonged conflict. It was a controlled outcome. A short-term engagement with long-term consequences already decided. Markets responded accordingly. Oil prices dipped in the immediate aftermath, a sign that investors believed the disruption would be temporary, that shipping lanes would remain open, that escalation had been preemptively contained. For a moment, the system behaved as if the plan was working. But plans like this depend on one assumption above all others, that the other side reacts the way you expect them to, that they absorb the shock, that they hesitate, that they fracture under pressure. And that is where this one began to break. Because the timeline that Washington had in mind, the fast resolution, the controlled environment, the predictable response, was already starting to slip before the first day had fully ended. The theory was clear, the execution was precise, but the outcome was never guaranteed, because Iran did not hesitate, it did not pause to assess the damage, it did not wait for a second wave, and it did not react the way Washington expected it to. Within hours of the opening strikes, the response began. Ballistic missiles launched across the Gulf, drones moving in coordinated waves, not one or two, but dozens at a time, aimed not just at military targets but at the broader network that holds the region together. Air bases, energy facilities, strategic infrastructure spread across multiple countries. This was not a symbolic reply, it was immediate, it was deliberate, and it was designed to expand the battlefield. Because Iran understood something the original plan did not fully account for. This war would not be decided in the first night. It would be decided in what came after, And that is where the shift began. The focus moved away from the strikes themselves, away from the initial exchange of force, and towards something far more difficult to control. Not the destruction of targets, but the disruption of systems. Shipping lanes slowed. Insurance markets reacted. Commercial traffic began to thin out as risk calculations changed in real time. Tankers that would normally pass through the region started holding position, waiting for signals that never came. And then came the move that reframed everything. The Strait of Hormuz, one of the most critical choke points in the global energy system, was no longer operating as usual. It was not formally declared closed in the traditional sense, but functionally it did not need to be. When enough vessels decide not to move, when insurers withdraw coverage, when the threat environment crosses a certain threshold, the outcome is the same. Flow stops, or slows to the point where the system begins to feel it. And when that system is responsible for a significant share of the world's oil supply, the effects do not stay local. They ripple outward. Prices begin to move, not gradually, but sharply. Markets that had briefly stabilized start recalibrating under a new set of assumptions. What was once seen as a contained operation begins to look like a source of sustained disruption. This is where the nature of the conflict changes, because at that point, the war is no longer confined to missiles and airspace. It is no longer limited to what can be measured in damage assessments or strike reports. It becomes something else. An economic pressure campaign unfolding in real time. One that touches fuel prices, transportation networks, supply chains, and political calculations far beyond the immediate region. One that forces governments, companies, and entire markets to respond, whether they are directly involved in the fighting or not. And that kind of pressure does not require dominance on the battlefield. It requires endurance, the ability to stretch the timeline, to absorb what comes next, to keep the system under strain long enough that the cost begins to outweigh the objective. By the end of the first phase, that shift was already visible. The strikes had landed. The response had been delivered. But the outcome was no longer being shaped by the opening moves. It was being shaped by what could be sustained. This is the part that doesn't stay overseas. It just hasn't reached you all at once yet. Because wars like this don't arrive as headlines for very long. They arrive as something quieter, something slower, something that shows up in places that don't look like a battlefield. At first, it's just a number, a small increase, a shift in price, something easy to explain away as temporary. But then it repeats. Fuel costs edge higher, transportation follows, groceries adjust, flights become more expensive. The kind of changes that don't feel dramatic in a single moment, but accumulate over time until they become part of your routine. And that's when the distance starts to collapse. Because the war may be thousands of miles away, but the system it's moving through is not. Every disruption carries forward. Every delay, every risk calculation, every halted shipment feeds into something larger. A chain that eventually ends somewhere familiar. A gas station, a receipt, a monthly bill that looks slightly different than it did the week before. And then there's the part that doesn't show up in prices. The names, the brief statements, the confirmations, the acknowledgments that come without detail, without context, just enough to mark that something irreversible has happened. Those are not numbers. They are people who were part of this before it ever reached the public conversation. Lives that intersected with a decision made far away, long before its consequences became visible. And all of it exists on a timeline that doesn't pause. Because while the conflict continues, so does everything around it. Elections approach. Expectations build. The space between policy and everyday life narrows in ways that are difficult to manage once they begin. This is where a foreign conflict stops feeling distant, not because it moves geographically, but because it moves into the system you're already part of. And once it's there, it's no longer separate. It's something you live with. And this is where the pressure begins to take shape, not on the battlefield, not in the strike reports or the daily briefings, but in the system that sits behind all of it. Because once the flow slows, everything else starts to move. At first, it shows up in the numbers. Oil prices begin to climb. Not in a straight line, not with stability, but in sharp, uneven jumps that signal uncertainty more than anything else. Markets that had briefly assumed containment now have to price in disruption. Not a temporary shock, but the possibility that the disruption might last. Shipping data starts to reflect the same shift. Fewer vessels entering the region, longer delays, routes being reconsidered, risk premiums rising, insurance coverage either becoming prohibitively expensive or disappearing altogether. Individually, each of these signals looks manageable. Together, they point to something else, a system under strain. Because the strait is not just a narrow channel of water. It is a corridor through which a significant portion of the world's energy supply moves every single day. When that corridor becomes unstable, even partially, the effects don't stay contained. They propagate. Fuel costs begin to rise. Airlines adjust projections. Logistics companies recalculate. Manufacturers start factoring in delays that did not exist a week ago. Governments begin contingency discussions, not because the crisis has fully materialized, but because the trajectory is becoming harder to ignore. And that trajectory creates pressure. The kind that does not announce itself loudly, but builds quietly across multiple layers at once. Economic pressure, political pressure, timing pressure. Because in Washington, the question is no longer just about the operation itself. It is about what happens if this continues. What happens if the prices keep rising? If the disruption extends beyond a few days into something longer? If voters begin to feel the impact not as an abstract geopolitical event, but as a daily cost, at the pump, in transportation, in the broader cost of living? Those are not distant concerns. They are immediate calculations, and they arrive on a timeline that does not wait for military outcomes. Elections are not paused for conflicts. Public perception does not separate cause from consequence. If the cost rises, it is felt. If the timeline stretches, it becomes political. This is where the war begins to intersect with something far more difficult to manage than strategy alone. Expectation. Because the original expectation was speed, control, a defined beginning and a predictable end. What is emerging instead is something less defined, a conflict that does not resolve quickly, a disruption that does not stabilize on command, a situation where each additional day adds another layer of cost, not just in resources but in credibility. And credibility, once it starts to erode, is difficult to recover in real time. This is the squeeze point, not a single moment, but a convergence of pressures that begin to narrow the available options. Continue, and the costs accumulate. Escalate, and the system absorbs even more strain. Pause, and the question becomes, what has actually been achieved? None of those paths offer a clean resolution. And that is what makes this phase different from the opening. Because in the beginning, the initiative was clear. The objective was defined. The timeline was assumed. Now, the timeline is the problem. Every additional day introduces new variables. Market reactions that cannot be reversed overnight. Political consequences that begin to take shape before the outcome is settled. International actors adjusting their positions based not on what was intended, but on what is unfolding. And while all of this is happening, the conflict itself continues. Missiles still move. Targets are still engaged. Statements are still made. But the center of gravity has shifted, away from the visible exchange of force and into the invisible accumulation of pressure. The kind that does not explode all at once, but builds and builds until something gives. And this is the context in which the call happened, not in isolation, not as a routine exchange, but at a very specific moment, when the pressure had already begun to converge, because until that point there had been distance, months without direct contact at the highest level, occasional statements, indirect signaling, but no urgent need to connect. The two sides had been operating on separate tracks, each managing their own priorities, their own timelines. And then, 10 days into a conflict that was supposed to be contained, That distance disappeared. Washington reached out. That detail matters, because in diplomacy, who initiates the call is rarely accidental. It reflects urgency. It reflects need. It reflects who believes the situation requires intervention. And by the time this call was placed, the conditions had already shifted. The operation had not produced a decisive outcome. The economic pressure was no longer theoretical. Markets were moving. Allies were adjusting. The timeline was no longer predictable. The system was tightening. So the call was framed, publicly, as something ordinary. A check-in, a conversation between leaders assessing a developing situation. But the timing tells a different story. This was not day 1, not even day 3. This was day 10. Long enough for expectations to be tested. Long enough for the initial narrative to begin to fracture. Long enough for the cost of continuation to become visible. And at that point, the conversation changes. Because now, it is no longer just about what happens next on the battlefield. It is about how to bring the situation under control. What options exist to slow the escalation? What channels remain open? What actors have the leverage to influence outcomes that are no longer fully in Washington's control? And that is where Moscow enters the frame. Not as a participant in the conflict, but as a position of access. Access to Iran, access to regional leadership, access to a set of relationships that had remained intact while others were under strain. Which means that when the call connects, the balance inside that conversation is not neutral. One side is looking for a path forward. The other is in a position to shape what that path might look like. That does not require explicit concessions. It does not need to be stated directly. The structure of the moment carries its own implications. Because leverage is not always about force. Sometimes it is about timing. And in this case, the timing aligned in a way that shifted the dynamic. Proposals begin to emerge. Diplomatic pathways. Ideas framed as de-escalation, as stabilization, as a way to restore predictability to a situation that had lost it. On the surface, these are standard components of crisis management. But underneath, they carry weight, because any solution that moves through this channel now passes through a different set of hands, a different set of interests, a different set of priorities that extend beyond the immediate conflict. And that is what makes the call significant. Not what was said in any single moment, but what it represents. A transition from direct control to mediated influence, from executing a plan to negotiating an outcome. And once that transition begins, it rarely reverses, because the center of gravity has already moved, quietly but definitively. And this is where the outcome begins to take shape, not as a clear resolution, not as a definitive victory for one side or the other, but as a gradual recognition of what this conflict was always going to become. Because by this point, the original objectives have already started to blur. The opening theory, fast strikes, decisive impact, controlled timeline, has run into something far less predictable. Iran did not collapse. The system did not reset. The pressure did not dissipate on command. Instead, everything stretched. The conflict extended beyond its expected boundaries. The economic strain continued to build. The political costs began to surface in ways that could not be contained within briefings or messaging. And in that environment, the question shifts from how to win to how to end. That shift does not happen publicly at first. It does not appear in statements or press conferences. But it becomes visible in the structure of decisions, in the timing of calls, in the language that begins to change around the edges. Because ending a conflict like this is not about achieving every objective. It is about defining what counts as enough, what can be presented as a completed mission, what can be framed as a success even if the underlying reality is more complicated. And that is where the next phase begins. A search for an exit, not an abrupt withdrawal, not a visible retreat, but a controlled transition towards something that can be described publicly as resolution. The elements of that narrative are already forming. Damage to key infrastructure, degradation of capabilities, disruption of networks. These become the pillars of the argument, evidence that the objectives were met, even if the system itself remains intact. Because the system does remain intact. Iran is still functioning. Its leadership has adapted. Its capacity, while reduced in certain areas, has not disappeared. The response has slowed in some ways, but it has not stopped. It has shifted into a different rhythm, one that suggests conservation rather than collapse, which means that any conclusion to this conflict will not come from total defeat. It will come from interpretation, from the ability to define the outcome in terms that align with the original goals, even if those goals have had to evolve. And that is where the external actor becomes central. Because once the process moves into negotiation, formal or informal, the role of mediation is no longer secondary. It becomes structural. The pathways that lead out of the conflict now run through a channel that did not exist at the beginning. A channel shaped by relationships, by leverage, by timing, and by interests that extend beyond the immediate situation. And in that channel, Moscow holds a position that is difficult to ignore. Not because it controls the outcome directly, but because it sits at the intersection of multiple influences. It has ongoing ties to Iran. It maintains dialogue with regional players. It is simultaneously engaged in a separate conflict that intersects with this one in terms of attention, resources, and global alignment. Which means that any movement toward resolution here can be connected, explicitly or implicitly, to movement elsewhere. That is how leverage accumulates. Not in a single demand, but across multiple fronts at once. And when those fronts begin to align, the negotiation space changes. Because now, the conversation is not just about one conflict. It is about a broader balance. What is gained here? What is adjusted there? What can be traded, accelerated, delayed, or reframed across different theaters in a way that produces a workable outcome for all parties involved? That does not require formal linkage. It only requires awareness. An understanding that decisions made in one domain can influence outcomes in another. And in this case, that awareness is already present. Which is why the call matters, not as a standalone event, but as the opening of that channel, the moment when the process of defining the end begins to take precedence over the execution of the conflict itself. Because once that process begins, the trajectory becomes clearer. A public statement will eventually emerge. Language will be chosen carefully. Terms like mission accomplished, objectives achieved, stability restored. The focus will shift toward what was done, what was prevented, what was secured. There will be emphasis on capability degradation, on strategic disruption, on the avoidance of a larger regional war. All of it framed as success, even if the underlying structure remains, even if Iran continues to operate, to influence, to respond. Because in the end, the measure is not absolute control. It is whether the outcome can be sustained, whether the costs stop rising, whether the system stabilizes, whether the political pressure begins to ease. That is what defines the endpoint. And in that sense, multiple actors can claim what they need. The United States can present the operation as decisive. Iran can present its survival as resistance. Regional players can present de-escalation as stability. And Moscow can present itself as the actor that helped make it possible. The intermediary, the connector, the one that facilitated movement when the system was under strain. That position carries value, not just in this moment, but in what comes after. Because relationships built or reinforced during crises tend to extend beyond them. They shape future interactions, future negotiations, future alignments. And that is where the longer-term implications begin to form. Because while the immediate conflict may move toward a conclusion, the dynamics it reveals do not disappear. They settle into place. They redefine expectations. They shift perceptions of control, of influence, of who sets the pace and who responds to it. At the beginning of this sequence, the initiative appeared clear, a defined operation, a defined objective, a defined timeline. By this point, that clarity has been replaced by something else, a recognition that control is not fixed, that it can move, gradually, quietly, without a single moment marking the transition, until one side is no longer setting the terms, and another is shaping how those terms are resolved. That is the shift that has taken place, not announced, not declared, but visible in the structure of events, in the decisions that were made, in the call that was placed, and in the outcome that is now being constructed. Because whatever form that outcome ultimately takes, whatever language is used, whatever framework is presented, the architecture behind it has already been defined. And the center of that architecture is no longer where it was at the start. It has moved, and it is unlikely to move back. And maybe that's the part that stays with you after all of this. Not the strikes, not the headlines, not even the call itself, but the realization of how quickly control can shift. Because 10 days ago, this looked like something contained, something calculated, a sequence of actions with a clear beginning and a clear end. And now, it feels different, less certain, less defined. Like the outcome is still being negotiated in real time, just beneath the surface. And maybe that's what makes this moment worth paying attention to. Not just what happened, but what it reveals. About power, about timing, about how wars don't always end the way they're planned, but the way they're managed. So the question now isn't just how this ends, it's who gets to define that ending, and what gets traded, quietly, to make it possible. Because somewhere between the pressure, the silence, and that one phone call, something already changed, and we're only just starting to see what that change really means. If you've made it this far, I'm curious. Do you think this was a strategic move or the first real sign of pressure? Let me know what you think. And if you want to keep following where this goes next, how this ends, what comes after, and what doesn't get said out loud, stay with me. Because this story isn't over yet.